This is one of our first lecture programs that we're doing in this room in combination with art viewing, so I'm very excited. Before we get started, I wish to acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University of Bloomington is built on indigenous homelands and resources. We recognize the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people whose past, or rather past, present, and future caretakers of this land. This program really came about when Svetlana Melnik, who is a senior lecturer in Slavic and East European languages and culture, approached me to see if the museum was doing anything to recognize and focus on the invasion and the tragedy in Ukraine, and mentioned, could we do a program? She remembered that I had pulled out some work by Ukrainian-born artists for her classes and suggested we do this combination. And I am delighted to do so and for that suggestion. Svetlana will be introducing our guest speaker, but before we get started, I'd like to recognize Janelle Rimmer, who is assisting with us today, as well as our registrars and installation staff for helping to bring some of the artwork. The program will have a lecture, and then we will have a little discussion of the artworks and some time for viewing. So I'm going to turn it over to Svetlana now, and again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Dear friends, thank you very much for coming to this event. Ukraine has been fighting against the full-scale Russian invasion for 247 days. Each of these 247 days have brought with them horrible news about losses and suffering. But at the same time, we have heard news about the enormous courage of the Ukrainian people, about their resistance and hope. These days, it's very important to spread the word not just about Ukraine's fight, but also about its accomplishments. One of such accomplishments is the Ukrainian artistic tradition, which our distinguished speaker, Dr. Myroslav Shkandriy, will be talking about. I would like to express my deepest gratitude to our sponsors who supported this event. The Robert Burns Russian and East European Institute and its director, Dr. Sarah Felix, the Department of Slavic and East European Languages and Cultures and its chair, Dr. Russell Valentina, the Eskenazi Museum of Art and Nanette Brewer, Lucien Glaubinger, curator of Works on Paper, who organized this wonderful exhibition, and the Ukrainian Studies Organization and IU and its officers Yaroslav Chali and Irina Voloshina, who are here today with us. Many thanks to the Center of Language Technology for recording this event. So, today I'm deeply honored to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Myroslav Shkandriy. Dr. Myroslav Shkandriy is a professor emeritus of Slavic Studies at the University of Manitoba. He has broad scholarly interests, which include modern Ukrainian and Russian literature and art, nationalism, avant-garde, and modernism. Dr. Shkandriy has written extensively on modern Ukraine. He has authored books published in Yale University Press, McGill Queen's University Press, Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies Press. Among them are Avant-Garde in Ukraine, 1910 to 1930, Contested Memory, Ukrainian Nationalism, Politics, Ideology and Literature, Jews in Ukrainian Literature, Representation and Identity, Russia and Ukraine, Literature and the Discourse of Empire from Napoleonic to Post-Colonial Times, Modernism, Modernists, Marxists, and the Nation, the Ukrainian literary discussion of the 1920s. Dr. Shkandriy has also curated the art exhibition Futurism and After, David Bourlou, and the phenomenon of the Ukrainian avant-garde in Canada. In addition, Dr. Shkandriy has translated famous Ukrainian authors Serhiy Zhadan and Mykola Khmelyovy into English. Please welcome our guest.
Thank you so much for such a generous and kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here at your wonderful university and in this fantastic museum. What I'm going to do today is to tell you a story about the recovery of rediscovery of Ukrainian modernist avant-gardist art. And it's not just a rediscovery of the works, it's also a rediscovery of history. Until fairly recently, many of the authors, the big names in Ukrainian modernist art, were known as Russians. I mean, if you look at their works in museums around the world, they're generally labeled as Russian. So I'm going to look at a few. I couldn't possibly look at many, but I'll try and go through a few of the big names. Just to give you an idea, not only of who they are and what they represent, but also of how they struggle to find their works, re-establish their reputations, and integrate them into Ukrainian history took place. So, some of the biggest names in the avant-garde were Ukrainians. And they said they were Ukrainians. They were proud of it. David Blyuk in the top left, who was the founder of Futurism. One scholar, Markov, said that without him, there would have been no Futurism in the Russian Empire. He's the founder of Futurism. With Kandinsky, he organized the first exhibitions, Odessa, Kiev, and then Moscow and St. Petersburg. Alexandra Exter later found fame in Paris, but she was a key person in Kiev that brought together different groups in 1918, 1919. Alexander Archipenko was from Kiev, who then found fame in Paris and in the USA. He is known as the founder of Cubism in sculpture. Vadim Meller, the theater designer. Anatoly Petrinsky, also a set designer and theater designer. Kazimir Malevich, the suprematist. Mikhail Boychuk, who created a school of monumentalism. Ivan Kavalavidze, also a sculptor and person who produced the first avant-garde films in Ukraine. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about these people and how the story develops. It's probably good to begin with Malevich. He's the big name. He is now world famous. But people forget that until this first massive exhibition took place in 1989 to 1990, just as the Soviet Union was collapsing. Actually, people didn't know much about him and had not really seen him. This exhibition was organized, the USA, George Bush, and Gorbachev, as an example of détente, pulled together these works. And exhibitions took place in these cities, catalogs came out in all of these cities. But he was presented as a Russian. In fact, he was the calling card of Russia, of the reformed Soviet Union. And this has been a tradition. 2-3 years ago, I went to the New Tate Gallery in London. Huge exhibition, pretty much the same as this, maybe even bigger. All of it was about the great Russian artist, the great Russian soul, the great Russian tradition, the great Russian painter. Not a single word about him being Ukrainian. And in fact, it was an anti-Ukrainian exhibition. But you have to understand that many of the people the oligarchs who sit on boards of these Western museums and galleries and hurry up to get money and support these exhibitions have a job to do, and that is to publicize Russian culture. So Malevich still is a contentious figure. However, he is Ukrainian, said he was. He was of Polish origin, but he was definitely Ukrainian. And if you read his autobiography, there are two autobiographies, but the 1933 one, over half of it deals with the imprinting in his early life of the Ukrainian aesthetic and how it shaped his world, how it shaped his art. I think actually more than half of it is about growing up in Ukrainian villages and small towns. Whenever Malevich is described, whenever catalogs are organized, that part of the autobiography is left out. Only a little bit, only a few pages during his time in Leningrad, in Moscow. That period is the only one that's deemed worthy of attention. But there is so much in Malevich that is that is related to what he saw as a child on the paintings on walls of peasant huts, the embroidery, black and red stitching, the ability of ordinary peasants to make their own clothes. He adored that. He said that they were beautiful. They were always beautifully dressed. They were always colorful, not like the children of workers in the factories. He was imprinted by this aesthetic, and he wrote about it with great attention and great passion. And in fact, the mystical symbolism of these colors and these shapes, I think, influenced his suprematism. But there's more. Towards the end of his life, when he had been arrested in Moscow, imprisoned, his work was, his laboratory was, he was prevented from working in his laboratory. He moved to Kiev. And from 28 to 30, he lectured and worked in Kiev with his old friends in the Kiev Institute of Art. And he produced a new series of art, sort of moving back to representation. Red, because that's the color of peasants when they work in the fields. Red hands, red faces. These are like the textile designs of Ukrainian peasants. And he moved then into this sort of neo-Renaissance painting, because he was working with Mikhail Boychuk, who was very interested in the Renaissance. They argued together. These are very typical of the first cycle of peasant paintings. But then the famine came, collectivization, the breaking, the war on the peasantry. And suddenly, Malevich's paintings become not red faces, but black faces. Suddenly, they're fleeing to the cross, away from the sword, covered in blood. Suddenly, his characters are running across a corridor of red, of blood. And this is about as far as he could go in expressing his horror of what was happening in the Ukrainian village. So Ukrainians write about this. They have integrated Malevich into their world. And here are these famous images from that second peasant period in Kiev. Nameless, faceless peasants with their arms as though bound behind their backs. This has always been interpreted and is interpreted in Ukrainian art history as an example of his protest against oppression. You should also be aware that his last exhibition in Kiev was in Kiev. He made quite a few works for that final exhibition. And we're actually not quite sure what happened to those works on the walls. So we're trying to recreate, scholars, art historians are trying to recreate what happened to all those works. Not all of them were accounted for. But he is very prominent in contemporary Ukraine. He's also claimed by Russia as a Russian artist, and he was, and he lived in Russia for quite a while. But his loyalties are clearly Ukrainian. When they decided to rename the airport in Kiev, the new airport, to name it, there was a competition as to after who it should be named. Well, Sikorsky, the helicopter maker, came out on top. The second choice was Malevich. Yeah, almost came out on top of that. There are now cafes, Malevich cafes. There are now, Malevich restaurants. He's been adopted, readopted. Another huge name, Archipelko. Really the person who broke new ground very early in the century. Came out of Kiev Art School, and he did these, for that time, very innovative sculptures. Boxing, for example. Here he is in Paris. Medrano, 1913. He was one of the first people to color sculptures, to make them out of different forms, different materials. These were very admired and still are admired. And he had a certain sense of balance and organization that was unique to him. And then later he did these amazing forms, where the voids, the empty parts, are part of how you imagine the figure. So he was groundbreaking. When he was in Paris, he was the person that helped organize the Ukrainian club. There were so many Ukrainian artists in Paris prior to the revolution, immediately after the 1917 revolution, immediately after the First World War. They had a house, they had a club. They met together. Archipenko organized the tours, and he sang in the choir. I mean, this was a person that was fully integrated into the Ukrainian community. But there's also another thing, and this is the harder thing to prove. But the art itself, the inspiration behind many of these works, many of these artists, was a Ukrainian inspiration. When he was a child, Archipenko used to go to school, and he would pass these these ancient stone sculptures that had been taken from burial mounds in the steppe. Nobody quite knows how old they are or how they appeared there, but they're very, very strange, woman-like, maybe symbols of fertility. And he would play on them. He would climb over them. He would enjoy them. But at night, when it was dark and he was going back from school, he was scared. He avoided them. Now that's an imprinting that has been left on his work. There's a certain mystical view of the past and the future, and the connection between the two. So when you look at some of his sculptures, they are reminiscent of some of the sculptures that he saw and he played with and he grew up with in Ukraine. By the way, that steppe idol is now right in front of the Kiev Art Museum. It's planted right there. Then there's Bolyuk. Well, Bolyuk invited all his friends, Mayakovsky and Khrushchev and Lifshitz, to the estate in Kherson, where his father took care of this enormous, enormous land. It was huge. And Bolyuk and his friends lived there for the entire summer. That's where they did their first plays, where they prepared their first publications, which would be published in Nova Kakhovka, just down the street, down the road. And that's where the Gilea, first name of the futurists, was Gilea. That's where it was created. Now, if that sounds familiar, Kherson, Nova Kakhovka, it's because right now those places are being bombed and fought over. That's exactly where Burluk's futurist group began. And he was in touch with Kandinsky, so his marriage proposal for the Blue Rider, the Blaue Reiter exhibition was 1908. This is his Cubo-futurist period. When he was in the steppe, growing up with his brothers, two brothers, they'd go into these big mounds and they dig up, these are Scythian burial mounds. They dig up all these artifacts, including plates and pottery. They found skeletons and dragged them all home. You'd get arrested if you tried to do that today, but he had a huge museum of these. And he copied or he played with the kind of symbols that were on these plates, Scythian plates, which you could turn in any direction you wanted to, and there'd always be an image. So he used this in the first scandalous futurist publication. And then he moved to the States. These are works that he did in the States. But I want you to notice, all the way through his career, there is nostalgia for southern Ukraine, for the steppe lands. These girls, often there are windmills, there's always a horse, there's a cottage of some kind. And he kept returning to Ukrainian themes. These are the Cossacks, Ukrainian Cossacks, with the strange horse, with his upside down horse, which he was so fond of. Cossack Mamai, a symbol of endurance, a symbol of self-sufficiency, and a symbol of Ukrainian character. He did these all the time. He kept returning to them. And in the Syracuse Museum, the University of Syracuse archive, there are works and references to works Ukrainian works that he made, the various Cossacks, like Sahib Dachny from the 17th, 18th century, and also his letters, the books that he ordered, that he wanted to read. He's tried to stay in touch with things Ukrainian. And there's a myth, or maybe it's not a myth, who knows? There is a legend, a family legend, that the semi-naked figure here in the famous record painting, Cossacks writing a letter to the Sultan, was the father of Bulyuk. He posed for this. Because all the Bulyuks were huge, they were big, they were strong, they were very proud of the fact that they were of Zaporozhian ancestry. And he wrote about that. He was extremely proud of the fact that he was of Cossack origin. He actually organized a family tree to show how he came from. He descended from this Cossack from several centuries ago. And of course, he made his own earrings. One, Cossack style, Zaporozhian style, just one earring. But this is the collection. This is what he made. So when he was in the States, living in Long Island, at that time, it was a place where poor artists had cottages. These are his two sons. Here he is with his wife Myroslav. But look what's on the wall. These nostalgic paintings of Ukrainian countryside. This was his enduring inspiration. Green cows, red horses, beautiful sunny skies, these wonderful Ukrainian nights. This is Bulyuk's world, and he kept coming back to this, right, all throughout his life. So what I'm saying is that he's imprinted by this Ukrainian experience. Now there was a political Bulyuk too. Well, I mean, he worked for a leftist newspaper, a Russian language newspaper in New York, and so he was smart. He kept in touch with the leftist people that paid him, and so during the war, he had this Lenin and Tolstoy. Lenin was the sun. Tolstoy was the moon. There he is. And there it is in New Jersey, plowing New Jersey with New York skyline. But in actual fact, if you read his words, he's much closer to Tolstoy, man of the earth, man of nature. And this is so Ukrainian. Not the mechanical, not machinery, not fascination with technology, but fascination with the earth, the powers of the earth. That's my interpretation. What do you? Well, the key figure, as I said, was in Kiev, 1918, 1919, was Alexandra Exter, who pulled together all the leading artists of the day. Now, there was a Jewish contingent because a lot of young Jews couldn't find work easily in other professions. They went into art. And they finished the Kiev art school, and then many of them were in her studio. Next to her was Bronislaw Nijinsky's dance studio, which later she transferred to Paris, found fame there. But this is the kind of work that was being produced at that time, 16 to 19, in the studio. Very colorful. She was also fascinated by Ukrainian folk arts. And she helped organize the first exhibitions of these naive artists, folk artists in Kiev. She also did, from Kiev, she did the costume designs and set designs for theater productions in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, Leningrad, I guess, after a while, but Petrograd and St. Petersburg. For Tayirov's theater, and Tayirov also, Ukrainian. So the connections were there, they kept in touch with one another. She did wonderful set designs, fantastic. At that time they were doing it in levels, so you could produce simultaneously action in different levels. She has there's a whole album of her set designs. Another person who's fascinating is, well, Exter is known, and her works are now getting some prominence. But Boychuk, although he was very well known in the 20s, he created the largest school of modernism in Kiev, in Ukraine, in the 20s. He was soon forgotten, and I'll also explain why. This is his first school in Paris, 1909. Then he moved to Lviv. He was fascinated by Western Ukrainian folk arts, especially the Western Ukrainian icon. So kind of interested in Byzantine art, but also naive art. And he got a commission in Lviv to restore paintings. He also did icons at the time. But when he moved to Kiev, he was pulled into the propaganda art, because those were the only commissions that his school could get. It was a very successful school. He was very prominent. He and his students restored in Mezhihiria, just north of Kiev, they restored an old factory for making fine pottery and made all sorts of products. Here they are, some of the leading students: Oksana Pavlenko, Marta Pliskivska, Ivan Padalka, and Sedya. So this is a photograph from that period. And they had a school, within the school of Boychuk, they had Jewish artists who also were recreating the old traditions of Jewish art in Ukraine. So this was a period when people were looking for roots to create the modern, to create the avant-garde. They go back into the past, sometimes the deep past, to create something that was new, often shockingly new. But the Jewish artists within the Boychuk school would take Jewish themes in the same way as Ukrainian artists would take Ukrainian themes or archetypes from Ukrainian tradition. So here is Manuel Shefman's Resettled from 1929. People would be thrown off the land. When the Tsarist Empire fell apart, the Pale of Settlement was no longer could no longer be kept. The border was no longer there, so people actually moved east or were forcibly moved. The Russian government made a corridor when the First World War began of 50 miles. They shifted everybody out of there, including the Jews. Well, there was a school in Kiev at the same time as Exeter was working, the troop was working, called Shkandriy. This was the strongest school of Yiddish literature and art and education in Eastern Europe for a while, especially the art school. It was the center for Yiddish publications. And it's very much admired today for its art and for its children's books, the art in children's books, especially. This is Mark Epstein, who was one of the leaders of the Kulturliga. All these works, there are hundreds of them, are in Kiev, never been shown abroad, totally unknown to this day. He's long overdue for an exhibition. The Kiev Kulturliga is long overdue for analysis. But I'm glad to say that next year, the first complete book on the Kulturliga will appear. And there are articles there about Kulturliga in music, in children's education, in secondary school education, in art, in theater, choirs. There's a whole Ukrainian Jewish episode there that is going to be better known shortly. So you have Alexander Exter in a studio pulling in Jewish and Ukrainian students. You have Kulturliga children's book art by people like Issachar ben Rybak, Al Lisitsky. They actually sent their works to Kiev to be published. And so all these publications came out in Kiev. Boris Aronson, who then moved to Europe and then to New York, became famous in theater art. Joseph Tchekhov, Mark Chagall sent his works. Now, the point that I always make to students is, if you look carefully, you can see there's a parallel revival of Jewish art, Ukrainian art. In the 20s, following what the Ukrainian People's Republic had done, the first independent state was, after the revolution, was created 1917 to 1919. But then, to gain support in the population, it also tried to pull in the Jewish community. The cities were 1/3 Ukrainian, 1/3 Jewish, 1/3 Russian or Russian-speaking in the east, and in the west they were 1/3 Ukrainian, 1/3 Jewish, 1/3 Polish or Polish-speaking. Ukrainians knew that for the cities to be able to win the cities, they would need support from the Jewish community. Tried to organize. It organized a cultural program that allowed cultural autonomy to Jews and other minorities. That program then became something that the Bolsheviks took over in the 20s with Ukrainization, or Korenizatsiya, indigenization, which meant Yiddish culture, not Hebrew, that was banned by the Bolsheviks, but Yiddish culture in Yiddish and culture in Ukrainian took off. And there was a parallel institution building. When you look at the art, say the manifestos of Boris Aronson, as published in 24 in Berlin and other places, they're very similar to the manifesto of the Wojciech School. This is the program. Draw on roots, go to the folk arts, to the ornaments, to the archetypal themes. Search for the creation of a national art that was modernist, contemporary, avant-garde, international. Move from copying and stylizing at first to individual creativity. Synthesize a people's art. Search for a deeper morphology, deeper grammar in culture. This is the program of both the Kulturliga, as explained by Aronson, but also the Wojciech School. So here's some examples of the Kulturliga's publications. They took fairly traditional themes, but they made them new. They made them unusual. They made them strange. You had, this is Galician Rooster by Chekhov. You had some traditional things, but they were always twisted, made fresh. Now, why was this banned? Why was this all crushed? Well, partly because 1917, the Ukrainian Academy of Art was created with Rychuk, with various other luminaries. That's Abraham Manevich, who was also in the Kulturliga. And it was viewed as too Ukrainian, the tradition was too Ukrainian. Also, when the Wojciech School in the 1920s exhibited, it did so internationally, and it did so with great success. This is from, I think, the Venice Biennale, 1927. So this was a threat. I mean, the idea of a modern, culturally successful Ukrainian art was perceived as a threat by the 30s, and it was shut down. And most of these artists were either silenced or arrested. Some of them were shot. The entire Wojciech School was shot. Their works were destroyed if they were frescoes. I'll tell you one interesting story. One former Chekist or KGB or NKVD officer came up to Oksana Pavlenko, who was a member of the Wojciech School, and said, "Look, I love your work, but I was told to destroy it, the frescoes, I was told to destroy it. At first I wanted to paint over them, but that wasn't enough. Somebody told me one day, 100 years from now, somebody might figure out a way of restoring them. So I had them, sandblasted. They were thoroughly destroyed if they were visible and they were Wojciech School's works. But about 1,100 were placed in the Spetsfond, the special fund in the basement of the Kiev Museum. And there was even a book, I call it the Doomsday Book, with about 1,100 works of art listed. And in the column next to them, they would give the reasons for the art being confiscated from museums. It had been bought for museums throughout Ukraine. One reason was formalism, too much attention to form. Another reason was bourgeois nationalism, too Ukrainian. Then there was the enemy of the people, which meant the artists had been arrested and likely shot. These works were kept. They only surfaced in the 90s, after independence. They've been restored, they've come back to light. The entire Wojciech school is now well known, but it's taken 80 years for this school to be restored. Another fascinating aspect of this rediscovery and restoration is Ivan Kalnitsa, the avant-garde sculptor and film director. In 1924, he produced this world-famous Artem in what is right on the border with the Donbass. Bakhmut, right? That's exactly where today, this very day, that city is changing hands on a daily basis. This was when it was opened in 1924. It was huge. There was a tunnel you could drive a car underneath. And it was a huge success. So Ziga Vertov, when he made his film Enthusiasm in 1931, this is a still from it. It was a symbol of the new Ukraine. the industrial Ukraine, the worker, the new lord of the country. And it was destroyed. Khrushchev didn't like it, so he singled out Kavalytsa for blame, and it was ruined. Another is the Artem, the second Artem in Shkandriy, formerly Slavyanogorsk, made in 1927. This is what it looked like. It was huge, like 7 stories high. The Germans tried to destroy it. You can see it's pock marked. But it survived, and this is what it looks like today. This photograph was taken a few days ago. A journalist friend sent this to me. It was like 4 or 5 days old. It's under Ukrainian control at the moment. It's huge too, and it's made of reinforced concrete in a way that was developed at the time. Now, this is an example of not only survival, but of recreation. Because this work, which was the worker, the Soviet worker, the Ukrainian worker, has morphed into a different interpretation. Now it is the Ukrainian worker facing east, facing the invasion from the east, and it's taken on a new meaning. So, in spite of the fact that originally it was to glorify Artem and the working class, it is now being adopted by Ukrainians. Not everything survived. The first very successful avant-garde films, Liva or Downpour, has been lost. It's been described as the most sought-after lost film in Ukraine today. It was apparently very, very good, but they still haven't found it. Then Perekop, which was made in 30, and Kolyushchina were made in 33. Initially, they were praised, but very quickly they were taken out of circulation. And the reason is because these symbolized popular revolt, popular revolution, popular revolt. And in 1933, when the famine was taking place, that's not a good theme, Ukrainian popular revolt, because they were revolting, they were fighting, they were struggling. So this was viewed as something bad. Kavalytsa has gone through many phases, his interpretation of his work has gone through many phases. But he has now come back. And amazingly, for example, 1911, this ensemble with Princess Olga was created and then destroyed in 23. It was recreated after independence, and now it has a place of prominence right in the middle of Kiev. This project from 1960 in his studio of Myroslav was never produced. He was under a cloud after the Second World War. But now, centerpiece of Kiev, right outside the Golden Gates, they've reproduced his sculpture. So here is an example of somebody that not only rediscovered, returned to Ukrainian art history and is celebrated after a long period of being left out. Now I know that you've got these works here, so I just want to tell you a little bit about emigrants. Sonia Delaunay moved to Paris early in life, but in her autobiographies she always explained and recognized the importance of her early life in Ukraine. Just like Malevich, the colors, the brightness, the skills of ordinary people in textiles, in painting, in embroidery. And she developed this school of Orphism, which was all about bright colors, geometric shapes, but she integrated also textiles into folk design into textiles, sought out new color combinations. So my point is, the influences went east to west as well as west to east. That's something that we forget about. That's something I write about in my book on the Ukrainian avant-garde. It was the influences were going both ways. And Leger, for example, said that Ukrainians, meaning Exeter and Delaunay and others, brought color into Cubism in a big way. Here she is, Simon Delaunay, with her wonderful designs. And there were others as well. I mean, this is a Jewish artist who we also have in the collection, Louis Mazon, emigrated from what is today Western Ukraine, Galicia, Ukraine, to the States, but went back, was fascinated by Jewish life in Poland, in Interwar Poland, made all sorts of interesting artworks, and is now quite well known in the West. Jacques Niezdowski was a post-war, post-Second World War immigrant. Here is his school in Zagreb. His painting of his school in Zagreb. Here he is as a young man. And he became very famous. First, he imitated Dürer art. He was influenced by Dürer, but he did these wonderful flora, fauna, which he's famous for. You actually have a bird here, a goose by him. He became very well known and very, very collectible. He's loved. And I think it was Kennedy, President Kennedy, in the Oval Office had two Niezdowskis on the wall of the Oval Office. So Niezdowski made it big after the Second World War. So I think, okay, I have to wrap up. So what's today's situation in Ukraine? A big revival of interest in modernism and the avant-garde in particular. Many works are being recovered, rediscovered, recovered, literally pulled out of these vaults and restored. But also the links between artists, the history of connections between these artists are being restored. And we've got a new sense of them as being part of a continuous Ukrainian art tradition. Also in the West, renaming and reattribution of art is taking place. So you probably heard about the MoMA changing the names. No longer, they're not listed as Russian artists, they're often listed now as Ukrainian, or Russian and Ukrainian, or Russian Jewish and Ukrainian, but much more sensitivity to the fact that they were from Ukraine or they considered themselves Ukrainian. And even the works themselves, like Degas, his Russian dancers is now being renamed Ukrainian dancers because anybody who looks carefully can see that the costumes are Ukrainian. So a sort of a rethinking is going on. But also, I think at a deeper level, there's concern with the inspiration that drove modernism in Ukraine. It wasn't only reaching beyond the horizon, looking into the future, doing something completely new, attaining something distant. It was also transforming the world spiritually and politically. Both went together in Ukraine. They were struggling for independence as well as for their culture to be recognized and brought to the table of the European art world. And I think also there's this searching for a deep grammar in culture, figuring out what was special about the Ukrainian art tradition and delving into it in much the same way as the Jewish artists in Ukraine were looking into what made their tradition special. So that is my talk. I think this is probably a good place to stop and allow me to ask questions.
I would think that they would be protecting the art instead of bringing it out. They're trying to.
protecting it instead of,
Well, it's subject to the bombing that's going on.
well, the stuff that's outside is sandbag. Most of it is now sandbag. Oh, that, you mean that big one, the big, the
I'm
big.
talking about the museum, that sounds like the museum is open.
No, they've taken a lot of works out. The walls of the museums are bare, most of them. They've taken the works to safe places. But that the big statue that I showed you is, I don't know, maybe too big to sandbag. It's still there. Well, it's semi bombing by the Germans, so maybe it's a little bit longer.
The archipelago sculpture that you showed, is that painted bronze?
I haven't seen it close up. And my feeling was that it was wood, but I'm not sure.
Okay. That's what I was, because when people talk about Jesper Johns, it's like a big deal that he painted bronze, and I'm like, oh, maybe he wasn't the first. So that's why I was wondering. Because a lot of times it winds up being a case like that, while the person who supposedly invented it actually didn't.
He did play metals, but I don't know about the dating. By the way, that's a wonderful archipelago right in Cornwall. So that's a very early one, and it's a great one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so wondering about what was happening in the 1990s in some of these museums in Ukraine. Was there sort of renewed interest in expanding art collections and focus particularly on Ukrainian artists? And also, was there any interest in claims to restitution?
Well, the first part is easy to answer. Yes, they were definitely. They were bringing up. It was an explosion. They were suddenly bringing to public attention and organizing exhibitions about all these artists that had been lost or forgotten. And actually, we were part of that. In Winnipeg, I organized the phenomenon of the Ukrainian avant-garde, which took lots of works on the Kiev Museum, exhibited them in Winnipeg, then it traveled throughout Canada and further. There was an attempt to sort of bring to the world attention the fact that they had these works, and they themselves were educating themselves. The first exhibitions of the Wojciech School took place at that time. They began discovering all kinds of artists and their writings, their works that have been in private collections hidden away for a long time. So yeah, there was an explosion. As for restitution, that's a big question. That's a political question. And I mean, many things were taken to Russia, but also, so you're not going to get them back. But also, during the Second World War, the Germans, in spite of their hatred of degenerate art, they shipped to Germany hundreds of works. They, not just from the Kiev Museum, but from Kharkiv Museum as well. Out of about 1,000, only about 400 came back. And nobody knows what happened to the others. For all we know, they may be down some mine shaft to this day. We're not sure what happened there. But how do you talk about restitution? It's difficult and almost impossible. Probably because you have to first of all prove the works were there, that they were taken, and then you have to sort of account for them. It's a very hard business. There are people studying it, but doubtful whether they're able to get much back, much compensation.
Were there any other questions?
So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the redistribution of goods happened. And we know that countries like Russia took a lot of embassies from all around the globe. They took a lot of military, but in terms of cultural stuff, right after the collapse, what was the biggest loss for the Ukrainian museums? And, like in terms of art, what would be the work that was lost due to that, the biggest one?
I mean, once the Russian border went up and Ukraine and Russia were separate countries, everything that was in Russia stayed in Russia, including all the works that they take from Ukraine. And Ukraine is the longer tradition, the richer cultural tradition, going back, way back, but also to the mosaics from Kiev and Rus era, the paintings, all that. It's in the Kremlin museums. I mean, it's being taken from Ukraine. It's actually Ukrainian art, or art from what was from Ukraine territory. And it never came back. But it's worse than that, because the Russian military is now systematically stripping Ukrainian museums, galleries, just stripping anything of any value. Scythian art, gold from the Scythian times. The Crimea. Crimea is a very, very old and beautiful territory that has a wealth of cultural artifacts. They're being shipped to Russia systematically. And the ones they can't ship, they destroy. So there's been an attempt to bomb museums, to lower the significance of Ukraine and its cultural centers. And this has been a long tradition. So that Kavaleriza ensemble that went up outside the St. Michael's Church or Sobor, Mikhailivsky Sobor, right in the center of Kyiv. It went up right outside the second most important church in Ukraine. The most important, the oldest and most significant is St. Sophia's Cathedral. But Mikhailivsky Sobor was the second most important because of its mosaics. It had fantastic mosaics. In 33, 34, Stalin tore it down because the logic was that they were going to build a procession route, a parade route. And they never did. It was a basketball court for 50 years. Until after independence, the church was recreated. It couldn't be restored, but it was recreated. But many, many monuments, architectural treasures were destroyed in the 30s by Stalin and afterwards. And the curators saved all those works in the Spetsfond in Kiev, 1,100 of them. They actually wrapped them up in rolls, threw them in a corner, and then designated them with a 0, which meant no artistic or cultural value whatsoever. And they sort of allowed them to exist there and save them. They just refused to destroy them. But the curators in Kyiv were forced to destroy a whole bunch of artworks. So in the early 50s, quite a few works were just burned. There's a duck next door trying to get in. That's quite appropriate for an avant-garde show. Any other comments?
Well, as soon as Janelle gets in, I'm going to have her turn the lights up and put the blinds up, and I can just tell you a little bit what I have on view.
Right.
And feel free to jump in and interrupt any lend your expertise. The first works that I have, the 2 sculptures as well as these 2, they're really a painting on paper, are Archipenko, and they range, as you said, from the wonderful work, the bronze from the teens. I apologize that we couldn't put the marble piece up, but it needs a new mount, but we wanted to be sure to show you that work. These actually go all the way through, possibly even into the 40s, into the 1960s, right before his death. So much later in his career, but you see the wonderful a continuation of the interest in the theme of the figure in a kind of an abstracted, and certainly the first one, very, very much kind of a cubist sensibility. I brought out this work by Malevich. I should say, just to acknowledge our second director, Thomas T. Sully, who really was instrumental in collecting much of this work because he felt so strongly about what he, of course, was thinking of the Russian avant-garde, but now we know the Ukrainian and Russian avant-garde, the importance of these artists. And we have a very strong collection of this material, both Cuban futurist, constructivist, supremacist work, much greater than many university museums. So it was really, I think, visionary for them to really note the importance of these artists. This particular work by Malevich, which might look very tiny, so I'm encouraging you, come up, look at it closely. We do have magnifiers on the shelves. This is a transitional work for him. It shows that influence of the Ukrainian primitivism, as well as he was exposed to the Cubist style at a show in Moscow in 1910 of what we call generally the Jacks of Diamond exhibition. So this particular work shows that coming together. It's called Peasant Scene, and you can see the abstraction of the figures into these almost cylindrical forms. So a very important work that you might not realize from its scale. This is a work by Sonia Delaney. This came to us as a gift from Steve Conant, a collector of prints up in Indianapolis. And his interest really was in it just aesthetically. It is a later work. I just recently dated it to around 1970, so much later in her career. It took a lot of digging around to even get it a relative date and title for this particular piece. I'm also adding to our representation of work by women in our collection, so we were very happy to have that. These are two work by Rozovic, who was also discussed. One is a drawing and the other is a lithograph. I think the drawing is actually done with a lithocrayon, so really very similar to his lithographs. I'm interested in more urban environments and industrial themes in contrast to the Malevich. And he's really an inspirational figure in the precisionist movement in the United States and also influenced some of the Art Deco style as well. I brought out this artist because it was a bit of a surprise. I was talking to Janelle and she said, I don't know, why is Louise Nevelson? I said, I realized, and I didn't realize that she was born in the Ukraine. Her name actually, she was born in Kyiv. She was born actually very close to the time, I think only about 6 or 7 years later, the Lozowick, whose style seems to be so much earlier. She's really recognized as being part of the abstract expressionist movement, as well as influenced by Cubism. She came to the United States, she was about 6. So kind of like Delaney, she also didn't live in Ukraine all that long. But Louise Nevelson, she was her birth name is actually Leah Berlowski, and she spoke Yiddish at home. She learned English at school. So I thought I'll bring out an artist that we don't generally even think of. Our label only says American; it doesn't say born in Ukraine, but she was born in the Kyiv province. This is our Zowski, and one thing, this is also quite late from his career. This is from, actually dated to the year of his death, so very late in his career. What struck me when I was just doing a little more research on him, this came to us in 2014 from collectors that lived in Warsaw, Indiana, and gave us a large collection. A lot of the artists had connections to illustration, which he does as well. But I hadn't realized how connected he remained to Ukraine and actually designed some postage stamps for the Ukrainian Postal Service. So I thought that was kind of an interesting, connection back to his roots. So I'm going to stop there.